It was a busy Tuesday morning at London's Heathrow Airport. The private terminal stood quiet and exclusive, away from the noisy main buildings where thousands of regular travelers rushed to their flights. The morning sun reflected off the glass windows, and a few expensive cars pulled up to drop off their important passengers. Dr. Sarah Mensah stepped out of her black diplomatic car, her simple navy blue suit neat despite her long mourning. At 52 years old, she carried herself with a natural confidence that came from years of hard work and success. Her short hair was styled professionally, and she wore minimal jewelry, just a wedding ring and small pearl earrings her grandmother had given her. Today was supposed to be a simple travel day. Dr. Mensah had just finished giving an important speech at the United Nations General Assembly, where she had discussed Ghana's new economic plans. As the first female president of Ghana, she had gotten used to making history, but she never forgot her humble beginnings as a young girl who studied by candlelight in her small village. "Madam President, let me help you with your briefcase," said Thomas, one of her security officers. He reached for her black leather bag, but she shook her head with a small smile. "It's okay, Thomas. I can carry it myself," she said. The briefcase contained her diplomatic papers and her speech notes. Dr. Mensah always liked keeping important documents close to her. It was a habit she had developed over her 25 years in politics. Behind her, two more security officers walked with her regular luggage. They were falling slightly behind because one of the bags had a wobbly wheel that kept getting stuck. Dr. Mensah had told them to get new luggage, but there had been so many meetings and events lately that no one had found the time. The morning air felt cool and fresh. Dr. Mensah took a deep breath, looking forward to getting back home to Accra. Her husband would be waiting, probably with some of his famous jollof rice. Their teenage daughter had exams coming up, and she wanted to help her study. These simple family moments meant everything to her, especially now that her presidential duties kept her so busy. As she walked toward the terminal entrance, Dr. Mensah noticed a security guard watching her. He stood very straight, his uniform pressed perfectly, with a stern look on his face. Something about his expression made her feel uneasy, but she pushed the feeling aside. After 20 years in public service, she had learned not to jump to conclusions about people. The guard, James Patterson, had worked at the private terminal for 3 years. He took great pride in controlling who entered the exclusive area. Every day, he saw famous people, rich business owners, and important politicians pass through these doors. In his mind, he had a clear picture of what these powerful people looked like, and the woman walking toward him didn't fit that picture. Dr. Mensah reached for her diplomatic passport in her briefcase as she approached the door. She had shown the same passport hundreds of times at airports all over the world. The small blue book contained her credentials as Ghana's head of state, but today it would lead to an unexpected situation. The morning sun disappeared behind a cloud, casting a shadow over the terminal entrance. A few employees inside the terminal were preparing for the day's flights, arranging papers and checking schedules. None of them noticed what was about to happen at their front door. Dr. Mensah was just steps away from the entrance when guard Patterson moved to block her path. His face showed no emotion as he looked down at her. The simple action of stepping forward would start a chain of events that would soon capture the world's attention and force people to face uncomfortable truths about prejudice in modern society. Her security team was still several steps behind, dealing with the stubborn luggage. In the next few moments, before they could catch up, an incident would unfold that would change not just this airport's future, but would spark a conversation about discrimination that would spread across continents. Dr. Sarah Mensah stood at the threshold of more than just an airport terminal. She stood at the beginning of a story that would soon make headlines around the world. Guard Patterson planted his feet firmly in front of the door. His hand rested on his radio as he looked down at Dr. Mensah with cold eyes. "Ma'am, the main terminal is that way," he said, pointing toward the regular airport building in the distance. His voice was loud and sharp, like he was talking to someone who couldn't understand English well. Dr. Mensah kept her face calm, though her heart started beating faster. She'd faced situations like this before, but it never got easier. "I believe there's a misunderstanding," she said quietly. "I'm scheduled to depart from this terminal." She reached for her diplomatic passport in her briefcase. "No, no," Patterson interrupted, holding up his hand to stop her. "This is the private terminal. VIP flights only." He spoke each word slowly, getting louder. A few people inside the terminal turned to look through the glass doors. You need to go to the main building. That's where regular flights leave from. Dr. Mensah tried again. Sir, I understand this is the private terminal. I'm here for my diplomatic flight to Accra. She kept her voice steady and professional, just as she did during difficult meetings with world leaders. Her fingers touched the smooth cover of her passport inside the briefcase. But Patterson wasn't listening anymore. His face turned red as he stepped even closer. Listen, lady, he said, dropping all pretense of politeness. I've worked here for 3 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. Now, I won't tell you again. The main terminal is that way. Inside the terminal, more people gathered to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene through the glass doors. A young woman behind the check-in desk picked up her phone, her eyes wide as she realized something was very wrong. Dr. Mensah finally pulled out her diplomatic passport, its gold emblem catching the morning light. Perhaps if you could just look at my credentials, she started to say, but Patterson cut her off again. I don't need to see anything, he snapped. I don't care what kind of ID you have. I know you're in the wrong place. His hand tightened on his radio like he was getting ready to call for backup. Behind Dr. Mensah, her security team finally caught up. Thomas, the lead officer, immediately saw what was happening. His face darkened with anger, but years of training kept him professional. Sir, he said firmly, stepping forward. You're speaking to the President of Ghana. Patterson laughed sharply. Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England. He reached for his radio, but his hand froze when a loud voice boomed from inside the terminal. What is going on here? Ambassador James Ousley emerged from the terminal, his tall figure commanding attention. He had been waiting inside for President Mensah's arrival when he noticed the commotion. President Mensah, I apologize for this incident. He turned to Patterson, his diplomatic smile replaced by a stern frown. The guard's face changed as he looked between the ambassador and Dr. Mensah. The color drained from his cheeks as reality hit him. His hand dropped from his radio, and his mouth opened and closed without making any sound. Inside the terminal, phones were still recording. Airport staff hurried to make calls, knowing this situation was quickly becoming an international incident. Through the glass, people could see the terminal manager running toward the entrance, his tie flying over his shoulder. Dr. Mensah stood straight and dignified, her diplomatic passport still in her hand. She had dealt with prejudice before, but never so publicly, never at such an official level. In her mind, she was already thinking about how to handle this situation in a way that would create positive change rather than just punishment. Ambassador Ousley stepped closer to President Mensah, positioning himself between her and the guard. I believe, he said coldly to Patterson, you owe Her Excellency an apology. Though I doubt a simple apology will be enough to address this unfortunate display of prejudice. The morning sun emerged from behind the clouds again, illuminating the scene like a spotlight. In the distance, news vans were already pulling into the airport parking lot. What had started as a simple morning of travel was about to become international news, and Guard Patterson was beginning to realize just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The terminal manager, Mr. Richard Wilson, burst through the doors, out of breath from running. His gray suit was wrinkled, and sweat showed on his forehead. What in heaven's name is happening here? He demanded, looking around at the growing crowd. Ambassador Ousley stepped forward, his voice controlled but angry. Your security guard here, he gestured at Patterson, who was now standing stiffly with his eyes fixed on the ground, just prevented the President of Ghana from entering this terminal. He refused to even look at her diplomatic credentials. Wilson's face went pale. He looked at Dr. Mensah, then at Patterson, then back at Dr. Mensah. Madam President, he stammered, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this situation. But the situation was already spinning beyond simple apologies. Through the terminal windows, they could see camera crews setting up their equipment in the parking lot. The videos taken by witnesses had already started spreading online. People's phones kept buzzing with notifications as the story went viral. Dr. Mensah's security team had formed a protective circle around her, but she gently waved them back. What concerns me most, she said, her voice clear and steady, is not the personal insult, but what this reveals about your training procedures. She looked directly at Wilson as she spoke. Patterson still hadn't moved or spoken. His face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray color. His hands trembled slightly at his sides as he realized reporters were rushing toward the terminal. His 3 years of working at this prestigious job were crumbling around him. Inside the terminal, the young woman from the check-in desk approached with a glass of water for Dr. Mensah. Her hands shook as she offered it. "I'm so sorry, Madam President," she whispered. "I should have done something sooner." Dr. Mensah accepted the water with a kind smile. "Thank you, dear," she said. This small moment of kindness stood in sharp contrast to what had just happened, and several people watching pulled out their phones to capture it. The first reporter reached them, microphone in hand, camera operator running behind her. "Madam President," she called out. "Can you tell us what happened here?" More reporters were close behind, their questions already starting to overlap. Ambassador Osi tried to step in front of the cameras, but Dr. Mensah touched his arm gently. "No, James," she said quietly. "This needs to be addressed." She turned to face the growing group of reporters. Wilson, the terminal manager, was frantically speaking into his phone. "Yes, sir, the CEO needs to know about this immediately. Yes, I understand the severity. No, sir, I don't know how this could have happened." The number of phones recording the scene had multiplied. Airport passengers pressed against the terminal windows, trying to see what was happening. Social media was exploding with different versions of the story, some accurate, some exaggerated, all angry. Dr. Mensah stood in the middle of this chaos, somehow maintaining her dignity and calm. She had spent years handling difficult situations, but this one was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever faced discrimination but didn't have the power to fight back. Patterson finally found his voice. "Madam President, I didn't know," he began, but his words trailed off weakly. What could he say? That he had judged her purely based on her appearance? That he hadn't bothered to check her credentials because he had already decided she didn't belong? More airport officials arrived, looking panicked. They huddled around Wilson, speaking in urgent whispers. Through the glass doors, they could see airport police making their way toward the scene. Dr. Mensah watched all of this unfold, her mind already working on how to turn this ugly incident into something positive. She had faced discrimination before, worked against it her entire career, but never had she had such a public platform to address it. The morning had turned into chaos, but Dr. Mensah stood steady at its center. In a few hours, this story would be on news channels around the world. But right now, in this moment, she had a choice to make about how to handle it. Her response would set the tone for everything that followed. As more cameras arrived and the crowd grew larger, Dr. Mensah prepared to speak. The world was watching, and she intended to make this moment count. The next few hours turned the private terminal into the center of a media circus. News vans lined the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching into the sky like metal trees. Reporters from every major network pushed against each other, trying to get the best camera angle. Dr. Mensah sat in the terminal's VIP lounge, watching the chaos unfold on the TV mounted on the wall. Her face appeared on every news channel. The headlines flashed across the screen. "World leader blocked from terminal." "Airport guards shocking discrimination." "Ghana's president faces racism at London airport." Thomas, her security chief, stood by the door. "Madam President," he said softly, "the British Prime Minister is on the phone. He wants to speak with you personally." He held out a secure phone, its red light blinking urgently. Outside the lounge, airport officials rushed back and forth like confused ants. The CEO of Heathrow Airport had arrived 30 minutes ago, his face grim as he watched the news coverage. He kept checking his phone, reading the thousands of angry comments appearing on social media. Patterson, the guard, sat alone in a small office, his head in his hands. 2 HR managers stood outside, discussing his fate in whispered voices. His uniform jacket lay crumpled on a chair, his security badge already taken away. "The video has over 2 million views now," said a young assistant, looking at her tablet. The original clips, recorded by witnesses inside the terminal, had spread across the internet like wildfire. People were sharing them with angry comments, calling for protests and boycotts. Dr. Mensah finished her call with the Prime Minister and stood up. "It's time," she said to Ambassador Osi, who had been writing notes for her upcoming press statement. "But first, I want to speak with Mr. Patterson." The room fell silent. Even the TV seemed to get quieter. "Are you sure that's wise, Madam President?" Ambassador Osi asked carefully. He had known Dr. Mensah for 20 years, and he recognized the look in her eyes. She had made up her mind. The walk to the small office where Patterson sat felt like walking through thick fog. Everyone stopped to watch. Phones came out again, recording this new development. Dr. Mensah knocked on the door gently before entering. Patterson jumped to his feet when she walked in. His face was pale, his eyes red. "Madam President," he whispered, his voice shaking. I don't know what to say." Dr. Mensah closed the door, leaving the curious onlookers outside. She sat down across from Patterson, smoothing her navy blue suit. "Sit down, Mr. Patterson," she said quietly. "I think we need to talk." For 15 minutes, they spoke behind that closed door. Nobody outside could hear what was said, but they saw Patterson wiping his eyes several times through the office's small window. When Dr. Mensah emerged, she walked straight to where the reporters waited. The cameras focused on her face as she stepped up to the microphones. The terminal fell silent, everyone holding their breath to hear what she would say. "What happened today," she began, her voice clear and strong, "is not just about me. It's about every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "But this is not a time for anger. This is a time for education. Mr. Patterson and I have had an honest conversation about what happened today. He has agreed to work with us to develop new training programs for airport staff worldwide." The reporters burst into questions, but Dr. Mensah raised her hand for silence. Sometimes, the best response to discrimination is not punishment, but education. Today's incident will become tomorrow's teaching moment. Behind her, through the office window, Patterson sat with his head bowed, tears running down his face. The HR managers looked at each other in surprise. Nobody had expected this turn of events. The airport CEO stepped forward, eager to show his support for this unexpected solution. But Dr. Mensah wasn't finished speaking. She had turned this moment of humiliation into an opportunity for change, and she intended to make sure that change happened. As the cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes, Dr. Mensah continued to outline her vision for how this incident would transform airport security training around the world. 1 week after the incident, Dr. Mensah sat in a large conference room at Heathrow Airport. The wall-to-wall windows showed planes taking off and landing in the distance. Around the long table sat 20 people: airport executives, diversity experts, security trainers, and James Patterson himself. Patterson looked different now. He had traded his security uniform for a simple black suit. His face showed a week's worth of sleepless nights, but his eyes held determination. He sat quietly, taking notes as Dr. Mensah spoke about her vision for the new training program. "We will call it the Global Respect Initiative," Dr. Mensah explained, pointing to the presentation screen behind her. "Every airport security officer will learn about diplomatic protocols, cultural awareness, and unconscious bias." Her voice was firm but kind, the voice of a teacher rather than an accuser. The airport CEO, Mr. Thompson, nodded eagerly. The past week had been a nightmare for the airport's reputation. But Dr. Mensah's approach to the situation had turned a potential disaster into an opportunity. "We've already received calls from 10 other major airports wanting to join this program," he announced. Patterson raised his hand slowly, like a student in class. When Dr. Mensah nodded at him, he stood up. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "I've been thinking about that first day of training," he said. Maybe I could share my story, tell them what I learned from my mistake." A surprised murmur went around the table. Dr. Mensah smiled. This was exactly what she had hoped for, real change coming from within. "That would be very valuable, Mr. Patterson," she said. "Your experience can help others understand why these changes are so important." Outside the conference room, the airport hummed with activity. Regular passengers walked past, not knowing that inside this room, a small group of people was working to change airport culture worldwide. Some tourists still took pictures of the terminal entrance where the incident had happened, which had become a sort of landmark overnight. Ambassador Osi, sitting next to Dr. Mensah, passed around copies of the training schedule. "We'll start with London's airports," he explained. "Then expand to Europe, America, Asia, and Africa. Within 1 year, we plan to reach every major international airport." The diversity experts shared their research and suggestions. One of them, Dr. Sarah Chen, pointed to statistics on her laptop. Our studies show that most discrimination happens because of split-second judgments, she explained. That's why regular training and awareness are so important. Patterson nodded, writing something in his notebook. He had spent the past week reading everything he could find about unconscious bias and diplomatic protocols. His mistake had changed him, turned him into a student of the very problems he had displayed. A young woman from the airport's PR team raised her hand. The public response has been overwhelming, she reported. Dr. Mensah's handling of this situation has gone viral for all the right reasons. People are calling it a masterclass in turning discrimination into education. Dr. Mensah listened to all this quietly. She remembered her father's words from long ago. When someone shows ignorance, you have two choices. You can punish them, or you can teach them. She had chosen to teach, and now that choice was creating waves of change. The meeting continued for hours. They discussed training videos, workshop scenarios, and real-life examples. Patterson shared insights from his security experience, now seeing everything through new eyes. The diversity expert suggested role-playing exercises and cultural sensitivity training. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, Dr. Mensah stood up to conclude the meeting. "Remember," she said, looking at each person around the table, "what happened last week was not the end of something, but the beginning. We're not just changing rules, we're changing minds and hearts." The group gathered their papers and laptops, energized by the day's work. Patterson was the last to leave, stopping at the door to thank Dr. Mensah one more time. She watched him walk away, noticing how differently he carried himself now. No longer a man crushed by shame, but someone rebuilding himself through understanding. Outside, the evening news would soon show clips from this meeting, spreading hope that even the darkest moments could lead to positive change. 3 months after the incident, James Patterson stood in front of 50 airport security officers in Heathrow's main training center. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone on his collar. This was the first official training session of the Global Respect Initiative, and he was the opening speaker. 3 months ago, I made a terrible mistake, he began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. I let my prejudices stop me from doing my job properly. I'd almost caused an international incident because I judged someone by their appearance. The security officers listened carefully. Some of them had worked with Patterson before. They remembered him as a strict, confident guard. The man standing before them now was different, humbler, wiser. Dr. Mensah sat in the back of the room, watching quietly. She had flown in specially for this first training session. Next to her sat airport officials from Paris, New York, Dubai, and Singapore. They had all come to see how this program worked. On the large screen behind Patterson, photos from the incident played silently. The security officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, seeing their colleagues' mistake displayed so openly. But that was part of the plan, to face these uncomfortable truths directly. When I stopped President Mensah that day, Patterson continued, I thought I was doing my job. I thought I knew what important people looked like. He paused, taking a deep breath. I was wrong, and that wrongness came from biases I didn't even know I had. Dr. Chen, the diversity expert, stepped forward to explain the science behind unconscious bias. She showed brain scans and research data, but kept coming back to real-life examples that everyone could understand. During the coffee break, security officers gathered in small groups, discussing what they had learned. Many shared their own stories of times they might have judged people unfairly. The room buzzed with honest conversations about race, prejudice, and change. The hardest part, one officer said to Patterson during the break, is admitting these biases to ourselves. How did you do it? Patterson looked across the room at Dr. Mensah, who was chatting with some officials. Because someone chose to teach me instead of punish me, he answered. And that taught me more than any punishment could have. After the break, they practiced real-life scenarios. Officers took turns playing different roles. Diplomatic officials, celebrities in disguise, regular passengers. They learned to check credentials properly, to communicate respectfully, to handle uncertain situations without making assumptions. Dr. Mensah watched all this with satisfaction. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from other world leaders and airport authorities, all wanting to know more about the program. What had started as one guard's mistake was growing into a global movement for change. In the afternoon, Patterson and Dr. Mensah stood together at the podium. The room fell silent again, everyone eager to hear them speak. This was the moment many had been waiting for, the guard and the president, standing side by side. Change doesn't happen overnight, Dr. Mensah told the room. It happens in small moments, in daily choices, in the way we question our own assumptions. She smiled at Patterson. Sometimes it happens because someone makes a mistake and then chooses to learn from it. Patterson nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. 3 months ago, I was a different person, he said. I thought I knew everything about my job. Now I know that learning never stops, especially learning about ourselves and others. The training day ended with each officer receiving a special badge, a small globe with the words, respect, learn, grow, written around it. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a reminder of their commitment to change. As people filed out of the room, many stopped to thank both Patterson and Dr. Mensah. The airport officials from other countries were already making plans to start similar programs at their own airports. Dr. Mensah gathered her papers, tired but happy. Tomorrow, she would fly back to Ghana, but the work here would continue. Patterson would keep sharing his story, teaching others what he had learned. The small mistake that could have ended his career had instead turned him into a teacher. Outside, the sun was setting over the airport runways. Planes took off and landed, carrying people from all over the world. And in one training room, a small group of people had taken the first steps toward making those journeys a little more respectful, a little more understanding, for everyone. 6 months had passed since the incident at Heathrow Airport. Dr. Mensah sat in her office in Accra, Ghana, reading reports from airports around the world. On her desk lay newspapers from different countries, all telling the same story, how one incident had started a revolution in airport security training. Her assistant, Mary, walked in with more updates. Madam President, New York's JFK Airport just finished their first month of training, she said, placing a folder on the desk. They're reporting a 50% drop in passenger complaints about discrimination. Dr. Mensah smiled as she read through the numbers. The Global Respect Initiative had spread faster than anyone expected. Over 200 airports had adopted the program. James Patterson had traveled to 40 of them, sharing his story and helping train their staff. On her computer screen, a video played silently. It showed Patterson speaking to a group of security officers in Dubai. He looked different now, confident but humble, a teacher rather than a guard. The shame that once haunted his face had been replaced by purpose. The United Nations wants to honor you next month, Mary continued, checking her tablet. They're calling the Global Respect Initiative the most significant improvement in airport security culture in decades. Dr. Mensah stood up and walked to her office window. Below, she could see the bustling streets of Accra. She thought about how her experience at Heathrow could have ended differently. If she had responded with anger instead of understanding, the world might have missed this opportunity for change. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ambassador Osi. He was in Singapore, overseeing their airport's training program. You should see this, his message read, followed by a video clip. The video showed a young security guard properly checking a diplomat's credentials, handling the situation exactly as the training had taught. Later that afternoon, Dr. Mensah had a video call with airport directors from around the world. Their faces filled the large screen in her conference room, each sharing stories of how the program had changed their airports. In Paris, our staff now speaks 30 different languages, one director reported proudly. We've hired translators and cultural advisors, just like you suggested. Another director, from South Africa, added, Our passengers say they feel more respected, more understood. Even small things, like greeting people in their own language, make a big difference. The success stories kept coming. Airports in Brazil, Japan, Australia, all reported similar positive changes. The program had grown beyond just preventing discrimination. It had become about understanding people better, making airports more welcoming for everyone. Dr. Mensah's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Patterson. He sent her a photo of himself with a group of security officers in Toronto. Teaching my 5th training session this month, he wrote. Thank you for showing me a better way. As the video call ended, Dr. Mensah opened her laptop to work on her speech for the upcoming UN ceremony. She wanted to remind people that change often starts with forgiveness, with choosing to teach rather than punish. Her daughter walked into the office, home from school. Mom, we learned about your airport program in social studies today, she said excitedly. Our teacher said it's a perfect example of turning a negative situation into a positive change. Dr. Mensah hugged her daughter, remembering that morning at Heathrow. Who could have known that one guard's mistake would lead to such widespread change? The program had even become part of school curriculum, teaching students about respect, bias, and the power of second chances. That evening, as she finished her speech, Dr. Mensah received one more update. Heathrow Airport, where it all began, had just been voted most welcoming airport in a global passenger survey. The article mentioned how the airport had completely transformed its culture in just 6 months. She saved her speech and closed her laptop, feeling satisfied. Tomorrow, she would fly to another airport, give another speech, meet more people working to make travel better for everyone. But tonight, she just smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. Outside her window, the sun set over Accra, painting the sky in beautiful colors. Somewhere in the world, Patterson was probably teaching another class, sharing his story again. And in hundreds of airports, thousands of travelers were being treated with new respect and understanding, all because one president chose to respond to prejudice with wisdom instead of anger. 1 year to the day after the incident, Dr. Mensah's car pulled up to Heathrow's private terminal again. This time was different. The terminal had changed. New signs welcomed travelers in multiple languages, and the security desk was staffed by a diverse team of officers. As she stepped out of her car, Dr. Mensah noticed the memorial plaque near the entrance. It read, "Site of the Global Respect Initiative, where learning replaced judgment." The plaque had been unveiled last month, marking the spot where a moment of discrimination had turned into a worldwide movement for change. Thomas, still her faithful security chief, smiled as they walked toward the entrance. "Quite different from last year, isn't it, Madam President?" he said quietly. Dr. Mensah nodded, remembering that tense morning 12 months ago. Inside, the terminal buzzed with activity. Security officers greeted passengers in their native languages. A young female guard, wearing the globe-shaped badge of the Global Respect Initiative, checked diplomatic credentials carefully but respectfully. "Welcome back, Madam President," said a familiar voice. James Patterson stood there, but not as a security guard anymore. His name tag now read, Director of International Training, Global Respect Initiative. He looked confident and at peace, very different from the shamefaced guard of a year ago. Dr. Mensah shook his hand warmly. "How many airports have you visited now, Mr. Patterson?" she asked, but she already knew the answer from the reports. 312, he replied proudly. "And each one has its own story of change. But I never forget where it all started." He gestured around the terminal. "Right here, with my biggest mistake and your greatest lesson." They walked together through the terminal, looking at the changes. Digital screens displayed welcome messages in dozens of languages. A new help desk offered translation services. Security officers wore pins showing which languages they spoke. A group of young officers in training watched them pass. They were part of the newest class of the Global Respect Initiative, learning not just about security procedures, but about cultural understanding and human dignity. Last week, Patterson told Dr. Mensah as they walked. A guard in Singapore stopped a businessman who was acting suspicious, but instead of making assumptions, she followed the training. Turns out he was a tech billionaire testing airport security for his new airline. He was so impressed. He's now funding scholarships for more diversity training. Dr. Mensah smiled at the story. This was what she had hoped for, not just changes in rules, but changes in how people thought and acted. The program had grown beyond her wildest dreams, touching lives in ways she hadn't imagined. Near her departure gate, a small ceremony waited. Airport officials had gathered to present her with an award. A crystal globe inscribed with the words, "For teaching us to see with new eyes." But Dr. Mensah knew the real award was the change she saw around her. As she prepared to board her flight, Dr. Mensah turned to Patterson one last time. "Do you ever regret that morning?" she asked softly, curious about his answer after all this time. Patterson thought for a moment. "I regret my prejudice," he said slowly, "but I don't regret what we built from it. You taught me that our mistakes don't have to define us. They can refine us, if we let them." The final boarding call came over the speakers, in multiple languages now. Dr. Mensah said goodbye to Patterson and walked toward her plane. Behind her, she could hear him starting another training session, his voice clear and confident as he shared his story once again. As her plane took off, Dr. Mensah looked down at Heathrow through her window. From up here, she could see the whole airport spread out below, busy with thousands of travelers from all over the world. Each of them would now experience a different kind of welcome than they might have a year ago. In her briefcase was an invitation to speak at the United Nations again, this time about how one incident at an airport had sparked a global movement for respect and understanding. But Dr. Mensah knew that the real story wasn't about her or even about Patterson. It was about how change can start with one person choosing to turn a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for growth. As London disappeared beneath the clouds, Dr. Mensah smiled. Sometimes, she thought, the best flights are the ones that take our hearts to new places of understanding.